For me, Dan Eston Gregory. Today, as part of our COVID inquiry week, we are once again examining the role of the public inquiry, not only in the UK, but its capacity as a tool for global inquiry. We'll be asking questions around the sufficiency of the current terms of reference that the UK government has put forward. We are analysing whether they're adequate to actually understand the full cost and benefits of the approach taken by the UK government. We'll also look at whether there is other approaches that may be necessary and perhaps what we should be looking forward beyond this in the wake of COVID-19, where we can actually begin to develop. And to help us answer these questions, I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Paul Freutas, visiting emeritus professor from LSE, who's been examining the effects of COVID-19 from a number of different lenses. Recently published a fantastic book on the pandemic response. We'll talk more about the book in a moment. But delighted to have you here, Paul, and can't wait to examine from the lenses you've been looking at, which it would be useful for reference from the audience point of view. Tell us a little bit about your background experience and how you've been able to use some of that experience to examine COVID-19 over the course of the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Dan, and great to be on the show. And I'm a big fan of what you've done the last 2 years. Yeah, my background relevant for this is that I'm a well-being person. I did my PhD on that almost 25 years ago now. And I've been heavily involved in my 5 years at the LSE in developing a well-being cost-benefit analysis that has in large part now been taken over by Whitehall, i.e. in the Treasury Green Book as to how to do evaluations and appraisals. And so I come from, as it were, a tradition in which you try and look at the effects of policies in terms of its effects on people's well-being. So years of happy life, you might say. So what matters is how long they live. So survival is definitely important, but also the quality of life. And that is then measured by how happy or satisfied with their life they are as a whole. And it's a very powerful methodology in that it allows you a reasonably fast look at what the important areas are in terms of policy's effects, and also to count up matters. So early on in the pandemic, around about February, I didn't really know what to make of things. I thought, well, if China and Singapore and several of the other East Asian countries instigate lockdowns, there's probably a good reason for it. And I didn't really pay much attention. Then the panic truly swept London and even my LSE students, and that sort of alerted me to the fact, oh, okay, there's a panic going on. And I paid more attention to, what do I think of it? And when I sat down and started to look at the magnitudes of likely effects of lockdowns, it struck me that they were a whole order larger than the promised benefits of lockdowns. And so what was sort of part of the crucial data on that? One of the crucial data was just how much economic activity lockdowns were disrupting, and in particular, how much that meant for government debt in the future, which I knew was very important because debt has to be paid back, and it usually has to be paid back via reduced services, reduced health services, reduced education services, reduced mental health services, reduced policing services, reduced army, everything basically. And from the well-being literature, we have a reasonable idea as to how important that is. And the importance of the increased government debt was at least 10 to 50 times higher than the reasonable effects that lockdowns could have, which were then sold under the notion of flatten the curve, which we've been doing for 2 years rather than 2 weeks. But even, of course, the flatten the curve argument was a little bit strange because it was predicated on the notion that people would be much better off in hospital if they had COVID than outside of hospital, and that's looking increasingly dubious. Because we know that many people put on ventilators didn't make it, partially because of the ventilators, and also they didn't really know what to do at that moment. There were other big ticket items that we in the well-being literature were aware of. One of the other big ticket items was that there's a huge mental health cost associated with distancing people from each other. So immediately in the first weeks of the pandemic, there was a huge increase in anxiety amongst children, increased loneliness, increased thoughts of suicide. We knew that those people who were single were going to find it much harder to find others. The lonely, and particularly those in nursing homes, retirement homes, were of course isolated from everybody else, so they were effectively put in solitary confinement. which is a horrible form of punishment. And then people get quickly demented and their mental health reduces tremendously. So we saw a doubling of mental health problems. That too is just a whole order of magnitude larger in terms of its effects on years of life lost than the possible benefits via reduced COVID deaths. So in effect, it was immediately clear to me in March that we were going to lose at least 50 times more years of life via these extended lockdowns than we could potentially gain. And looking comparatively over countries, by about June, it was clear that there was no gains from lockdowns at all. If anything, they just increased the number of COVID deaths. And so it became very clear that this was nonsensical, and it was quickly driven by opportunist politicians, businessmen, and medics who saw this as a device to make money and increase their own power.
Yes, I mean, there's a few things I'd like to unpack and extract here, because I think what we've witnessed is this generalized belief that lockdowns were necessary in order to reduce the impact of the virus, and this has become a common belief set within the vast populace, but not just the population of the general public, but politicians and even the scientific community alike. So I think what we've gotten at the opportunity with the public inquiry is really to take stock and actually take a step away from some of those prior conclusions that some may have drawn under the heat and the panic of the pandemic, and actually start looking objectively at this. I think there is the opportunity. Whether that will happen or not is a different question. But I think one of the concepts we've just outlined there is one of the hardest that people have struggled to get their head around, is this idea of creating comparable years of life lost between the potential for COVID to impact mortality versus all of the other factors, whether it's the economic factors, the erosion of the kind of healthcare system, particularly in terms of service, mental health, suicides, all these other variables that will clearly also impact mortality in the short and long term. But I think it's very hard for people to grasp that. Could you explain that concept a little bit from an economic standpoint, how people can start to make sense of that kind of comparable metric of years of life lost?
Yes, and let me at the outset say that this is standard methodology used for dozens of years in pretty much all Western countries for lots of programs. So we're looking at something that was sort of abandoned immediately at the start of the pandemic against standing public health advice pandemic plans, which are all based on this logic of trying to improve the number of years of life lived in the population. So when it comes to buying medicines in the UK, when it comes to allocating resources over competing health claims, the methodology of looking at years of life is standard. That is what has guided public decision making for decades in this country. And the fact that that was abandoned was deeply unscientific, and told you that it had nothing to do with good public policy, but was just a panicked reaction. The principle of looking at qualities of length of life is partly that you try and work out how much a particular policy will affect length of life. That has to do, of course, with survival. You never know exactly how much that goes, but you do have rules of thumb. We know that, for instance, the difference between a smoker and a non-smoker, all else equal, is something like 7 years. We know that people who are much less happy in life and are depressed have several years less in life to go. So we also know that the quality of life in terms of how happy you are actually affects the length of life. We know that expenses on regular health sort of quickly buys you additional years of life. So one of the numbers that is used by the Department of Health is that for £15,000, you can basically generate another year of life by improved health services. So we have mainstream estimates based on sort of tens of years of data in terms of, if you increase the amount of money that a particular region gets, and that is then spent on, let's say, cancer prevention or improved health services for people who have diabetes or other problems, that then for £15,000, you are basically generating another year of life lived. Now that £15,000 can then be used to, as it were, value how much reduced government spending in the future is going to lead to reduced years of life, because it just means that in the future you won't have that money to spend. And that has been one standard methodology, and that, for instance, has been used by David Miles and his team of the Imperial College London to also say very quickly on, I believe in April 2020, that we were going to lose 50 years of life for every year of life that was gained via the lockdowns. The well-being cost-benefit analysis goes one step further, which is that we consider more than just physical health. We consider that people care about more than just whether or not they can move around and are free of pain. We also consider that they care about their loved ones, that they find their own mental health, peace of mind importance, that they care about their status in life, how well their country is going. And so that notion is based on asking people how satisfied they themselves are with their lives as a whole, which is taken to be, as it were, a vote as to how much they value what their own circumstances are at that moment. And that gives you a very powerful tool, because let's say in a year that you are married and in the year after, we know that that roughly increases your happiness by one well-being, as is it known. So that's 1 unit of life satisfaction 1 year for one person. And that's sort of spread out over a few years. So it really does matter. And a year of life is, roughly speaking, 6 well-beings. So if you like, marriage is akin to giving you an extra 2 months of life, or another way to say, you'd be willing to live 2 months less in exchange for, as it were, the happy marriage event. And that too, hence, allows you to evaluate things, right? So if you disrupt 6 marriages, it's basically the same as reducing length of life for one person by 1 year. So it allows you to evaluate millions of marriages lost or gained relative to, let's say, 1,000 deaths, right, of a particular age range of people who had a certain number of years to go. So that, in a nutshell, is the methodology. You line up what you know about the quality of life, and you say, okay, well, one can improve or give up things in that dimension and trade it off with length of life. And that then leads you to policies on the quality of life, everything that has to do with that, versus the length of life and everything that has to do with that.
Okay, so I think there's some really important points here as a pretext to when we examine the COVID inquiry and whether it adequately address these functions. But I would like to unpack the well-being notion a little bit more, if I may. Now, you said that this has been Whitehall themselves have actually adopted this from mid 2021, which I would like to touch more on in a moment. But I'm thinking about how the way we may maybe slightly digress in order to kind of bring context to this, but the way we examine standard of living traditionally is through GDP per capita and average number of years lived. Is that on the notion that these two benchmark markers, for instance, when we look at standard of living, does that presuppose that things like well-being are by default going to increase with them? And the reason I take that kind of parallel example is I'm trying to make sense of, those that were looking at the COVID metrics. Is there an assumption somehow that these things are going to be positively impacted if we can reduce number of COVID deaths? I'm trying to make sense of the logic of not using these types of methodologies.
I think the logic of looking at COVID basically falls apart if you want to say that comes out of a concern for years of life lived, because then you'll be equally concerned with all other disruptions of health that you are then doing at that moment. And the other disruptions of health, as we know from the calculations of the Department of Health itself, have been far more damaging towards numbers of years of life lived now and in the future than COVID itself, or certainly that the reduction of COVID deaths, supposedly by policy, would have brought us. So there is no, as it were, logic to counting COVID deaths other than that it has been a new obsession, and that we suddenly pretended that the only point of life is not to die of COVID. It's fine not to have any quality of life or to die of something else as long as you don't die of COVID, which is, of course, an absurdity. Now then, in terms of what did we used to do before we started to care about mental health? Roughly 20 years ago, we really started to get concerned about that. There was the presumption that, as it were, material welfare, the number of physical goods you had, the size of your car and your house, that would immediately feed over to happiness and to mental health. And we've become more and more aware of the fact that that's not the case, right? Of course, you don't want to be in dire poverty. That's very bad for your mental health and also for your happiness. But beyond, as it were, a minimum material level, what matters much more is the quality of your social interactions. That is a big one. Your status in life. We are sensitive to how well we are regarded by others, our position in our job, and generally speaking in the community. That matters a lot. But also our loved ones matter. So people are willing to give up part of their own health so that their kids will do better. And that is something that matters for them. And hence also their future matters and their country matters. People are willing actually to give up quite a bit to feel that they're in a country of which they can be proud. And so we've started to sort of become more aware of that. But what was not yet normal inside the bureaucracy was to have a methodology by which to make that explicit. So it was always implicitly found to be important. National pride was found to be important. We made investments in that. Mental health was found to be important and was invested in terms of pastoral care, for instance. But now we make these things explicit, and that allows a more rational conversation, a more rational trade-off as to, okay, how much is national pride worth versus the number of Britons alive in 10 years. And so we can now make those debates more scientific.
Well, so, okay, again, I know this is a point of fascination. We've not really ever been able to cover this in such depth as someone of such depth of knowledge on this. So I just want to just extract a couple more points before we move on to talk about how this relates to the inquiry. Firstly, one of those key metrics you mentioned was, social relationships, social bonds. Now, clearly, the lockdowns themselves have devastated social bonds and social connections. Many other, I think about so many other things that bring me joy that were prohibited during the lockdowns. But it wasn't just lockdowns, because it created a culture of fear whereby even in the absence of lockdowns, and again, this is another argument around the behavioral science, is that you don't necessarily need lockdowns. You need public health messaging, and people will adapt their behavior accordingly anyway in the absence of lockdowns. But that aside, on one hand, we've seen the erosion of those social connections. But on the other hand, and this is reference to what I discussed with Professor Matthias Desmond on the show around meaning and purpose, and the notion of national pride. There was this sense that this notion of solidarity in fighting and tackling COVID together, this externalization of meaning and purpose and pride in order to tackle the virus. Do you think that played a role in kind of mitigating people's own sense of lost well-being? Because it felt to me people were very open to letting go of their own well-being. If they had a personal well-being marker and you were able to measure it on your phone, I would have thought your personal score would have dropped significantly. But there's this idea that they're working in the collective interest for whether it's national pride or collective pride. Do you think that played a role in the public's behavior in the context of the response?
Definitely. But there are 2 points there which are quite distinct, right? One is indeed the huge impact of reductions in, as it were, warm social relations, partly just because of direct government mandates on whom you could meet, whether you could visit each other for Christmas and for other festivities, and how many people were allowed to be in the household. And the knowledge of well-being was such that pretty much all the well-known well-being economists in the UK spoke out in some form or another against the lockdowns, or at least with very heavy question marks at the start, because we knew that these social, as it were, diktats were going to be highly damaging to well-being and of a totally different order of magnitude loss than what could possibly be gained. And so there were early pieces by Daniel Fujiwara, who does a lot of work for Whitehall as well in terms of cost-benefit analysis on well-being, and Paul Dolan, and they pretty well calculated that indeed, as it were, the social loss due to the lockdowns, due to the actual diktats, so not so much the national anxiety, which has a bit of an effect, but the actual, as it were, forbidding people to see each other, was worth almost 10% of well-being. Now that's like taking away 3 days of every month. You say, well, 3 days of every month is not much to protect others. But if you take 3 days away of every month of 70 million people, that quickly starts up as equivalent to hundreds of thousands of deaths in a very short space of time. And the second point, hence, to make is on this what Desmetas called, I think it was mass formation psychosis, and what I and my co-authors in our book have called crowd psychology, and as it were, the unwisdom of crowds, you might say, the madness of crowd, as Mackay, the poet, said it almost 2 centuries ago. And yes, indeed, there has been crowd behavior, and the crucial thing about that crowd behavior is this intense focus that there's been at the national level on, as it were, metrics which you wouldn't possibly find important 5 years ago, and you couldn't possibly still find important 5 years from now, because you won't have any other society society left if you only focus on one particular metric of one particular disease and say that's what life is about, rather than the whole gambit of life. And that has been fanned by propaganda. It has also been instigated by the lockdowns itself, which mobilize people, which force them to, as it were, abide by the logic of, oh, it's all about COVID numbers. And it's a very scary phenomenon. We've, of course, seen that famously in the 1930s of the last centuries, but really humanity has seen that kind of obsessive crowd behavior many times in its history, and it hardly ever bodes well. Right? It is, as it were, a form of marching, and God knows where the marching will end, but it usually is not to a good end.
The last point I want to make on this, just because it brings up a salient point for me. I was reading an article within a scientific journal a couple of weeks back that was assessing. They were comparing the idea of an individualistic versus a collectivist society and examining what they believed. They were trying to demonstrate that individualist societies fared less favorably in response to COVID-19. But once again, they only focused on COVID mortality. There's no reference to other indicators: economic, healthcare, education, mental health, well-being. And I would be fascinated to take an overall assessment of the same idea of cultural individualism versus cultural collectivism to witness, actually, if you take the aggregate of those kind of, to me, it's like looking at a dashboard in business. If I only look at my costs and that's all I obsessively focus on, that, customer satisfaction, revenue growth, all of those things, brand reputation, a whole plethora of really key indicators that are really important, would just be overlooked and probably, lead to failure. But it feels like this the crux of this, leading into the conversation about the public inquiry, is this myopic focus. It's just too narrow. What?
Absolutely. And the focus basically extends that daftness, if you like, right? That misappropriation of our attention space. So the public inquiries, terms of reference as they are now, are all about, what has the reaction been? So what happened in hospitals and nursing homes and this and that, purely descriptive in some sense, and then immediately jump to, what can we do next time to be more prepared for that? And there's no question in there as to the costs and benefits of actual policies, which you'd think would be the crucial step, which has been the normal step to take for the last 30 years in this country on all major things. And now suddenly all good principles of public health and of a public policy making are thrown overboard, so as not to have to ask the question, was it actually worth it? Have other countries had better outcomes with different policies? What has been the costs and benefits of that? No, suddenly, as it were, as I said, 30 years of best practice are thrown overboard, and it's clear that basically the answer to the crucial question is already presumed to be yes. Things were worth it. So it's all about just what did we do and how can we do more of it next time? Which is, of course, I wouldn't even call that a public inquiry. I call that public whitewashing.
Well, agreed. And I think in the pretext to the public inquiry, there's, and I'll act sensitively here because I am aware that people have lost loved ones to COVID, but again, we know that there's the way it's been measured and accounted for leads to some very dubious understanding of what warrants and necessitates a COVID death, and I think that in itself needs to be examined. But the kind of pre-framing is that we need to listen to the bereaved, and whilst I do agree that's a necessary component, and actually the bereaved have been campaigning for that, you could argue that we're all experience a different form of bereavement, a bereavement of a life that we were not able to live within that period of time. I didn't get to see my niece growing up. My parents weren't able, therefore, to see their granddaughter, and these are just small things. I know just in my own family, my entire family weren't able to see. My wife's family weren't able to see, or Lizzie wasn't able to see her grandfather, and these things may seem, the people have trivialized these things in the context again of COVID mortality being the whole factor. But do you think that the scope of the inquiry has to look at it through that lens of well-being that you've touched upon, rather than just examine it, from the impact level, looking at the impact on the individual and society from that lens. Is it your hope that something like Wellbe could be a tool that could be used within the context of a public inquiry? I mean, how could it be used to assist the support?
It could be used very easily because Whitehall itself now has quite a bit of experience with looking at well-being cost-effective analysis. And of course, it is uniquely well set up to look at effects on a wide range of dimensions. It's well set up to look at child mental health, to look at what will happen in the future when government debt has to be paid back, the importance of the unemployment suffered, the importance of small businesses destroyed, also the long-term importance, of course, of freedom and of the workings of our institutions. And so, yes, it would be pretty easy to do. Basically, Whitehall and the associated think tanks and, as it were, service deliverers around it are perfectly capable of doing a well-being cost-benefit analysis on quite a few of the COVID policies pursued. But the old metric of QALYs, which is effectively physical health based, would do just as well. It would get you the same outcome, which is, of course, why the inquiry won't look at it. And so, yeah, as almost any metric that takes a whole view of life, whether it's whole health or happiness as for an individual, will get you to a similar outcome, and hence will be avoided like the plague in this inquiry, because then also totally different questions come into view, which was, well, was this warned for beforehand? Are there, in fact, things like the Nuremberg Code, which in past decades have criminalized looking away from the full consequences of a public health experiment? And has that happened in this case? And should there be justice on the basis of that? Right? One is suddenly into a whole different ball game when one truly looks at costs and benefits and the question of have those been considered? And if not, well, that is a violation of some pretty high-powered legal principles. So, no, there is just no way that there will be the political will to do that in this inquiry. So, as I said, we're looking at a whitewash, and in that sense, I fear the whitewash is what will be copied in other countries. Once again, the UK will give a bad example, which will lead to a missed opportunity for the world, and will, as it were, rubber stamp the bad behavior this time round. And well, we all know what happens if you reward bad behavior. You're going to get a lot more of it.
I mean, that's the worrying part for me on this. And actually, you're absolutely right. The UK offers an opportunity here, and that's why, you know, we're going to do our best to try and help influence the terms of reference. And I'll touch upon what else, you know, I think the other part of the conversation has to be, if we presuppose with, you know, if we hold a low bar for the public inquiry, which I think in terms of expectations is the right thing to do, given historic investigations of this nature. But what would you say first and foremost would be the most important thing that this inquiry could focus on? You know, what should be the primary focus, do you believe?
I think it should be the costs and benefits of some of the major parts of the policy response. So the stay-at-home orders, closing down of schools, preventing exams, imprisoning elderly and the supposed vulnerable inside nursing homes, making it impossible for families to visit those about to die, and so losing out on the grieving process. The forced unemployment of large swathes of the population who were then also belittled by being termed inessential. The closing down of IVF services, which meant that many thousands of Britons did not come to life because they were simply not allowed to, as it were, been facilitated into existence. And so I think that the costs and benefits is the clear way to go for this public inquiry, and one can define as it were reasonably clear policy that one can hold up to the light in that way. And of course, when looking to the future, one shouldn't just look at the costs and benefits of what's been done. One should also look at, well, what could be done. And part of that is, of course, looking at, well, how did other countries fare better? So what has been best practice, if you like, in the world? Sweden, of course, comes to mind, but the whole of Scandinavia, really, which has had a very similar level of restrictions, comes to mind as a shining example within Europe as to what to do with associated better outcomes on almost any metric. But yes, one can also look at what a country like China has done, but then fully look at what the collectivist country of China has done, and hence also take into account the huge drop in the number of kids and of mental health in that country. because of the disruption of social life there. And so that would be the low-hanging fruit, right? Then the notion of justice, I think, is very important because this is a medical public inquiry. And so very much the question should be, have the Nuremberg laws and principles been followed? And if not, what are the consequences of that, right? There is an ethical dimension there. We have learned from the nasty experiences of the 30s and 40s how badly public health can be abused for political purposes and how easy it is to look away from the victims of public health policy. And that should definitely be part of this inquiry too.
Now, it seems like, in reference to this point, if you're beginning to compare the performance against other countries, for instance, to me, it feels that there needs to be a common, and this perhaps is a lesson that can be learned for future pandemics, is that there needs to be a common understanding of what the dashboard should look like. Because, again, if the government takes its current approach and compares with other countries, all they're going to look to is which countries suffered the lowest volume of COVID deaths per capita and start to extract what lessons that could offer. But indeed, the press and the medical community, that seems to be, again, still stuck in this myopic mindset. And your point around rewarding bad behavior, to me, this is our greatest opportunity to really take stock and say what should we be looking at in order to compare. Because the old adage, if you can't hit a target, you can't see. If we're not going to define what the metrics are of a successful response to a given threat like this, then the highly likelihood is that we will witness the same thing happen again, just in stronger proportion. I mean, how can we use this opportunity in that regard to then actually develop that common sense set of metrics? Because, and I appreciate it, it's fantastic what you've described in terms of Welby, and what a fantastic piece of work. But there's some things that seem so intangible. The joy of life. To try and quantify that, I appreciate, comes with challenges. But there are observable elements that we can start to witness. Do you think this is a starting point before we even enter into the terms of conversation around a public inquiry? What constitutes how do we measure the outcomes? Sure.
I think the answer to that is in a way pretty simple, which is that these outcomes were measured right up until the start of 2020. So public health and its many prescripts on what to do in case of a pandemic, and many blueprints were ready. They were based on this kind of holistic view of all the things that would matter. And the standing advice was never to do something as stupid as lockdowns, because it would be far too disruptive and it wasn't anticipated to work. As we've seen, they've not worked. So in a sense, there doesn't need to be new invention. There just needs to be going back to the sanity of 2019 or even of January 2020, right? And of course, that would be an admission that there's been a kind of madness the last 2 years. And I fear that the powers that be, of course, will be extremely afraid of return to sanity. So they want to keep us on a madness trajectory. And I fear that's the other thing to say, that Dan, you and I are still among the few, but also among the dangerous few who cannot possibly be listened to when it comes to the terms of reference of this inquiry, because it would be far too damaging to the people organizing it. And so in that sense, I think you and I have a very different question to answer, which is, where is this going? How long is this going to go? This kind of negation of what matters in life, where to might it go? And what would our role be? Is it just about, lockdowns did damage, look at that and that? Or is there a wider conversation to be had in terms of our societies having gone off the rails, having sort of been taken over by people rewarded for bad behavior? And what are we going to do about it? What hopeful ideal can we present ourselves, our loved ones, and down the line convince other parts of society with?
Well, I think this is this to me, we're on the same page with this important notion. In fact, this episode actually will be the last episode under the Pandemic Podcast brand, because we're launching a new brand called Elevate, which is all about the forward-focusing element about how do we elevate humanity, how do we enrich the world, and it's asking these bigger questions in the wake of COVID-19. And it's not just COVID-19; it's actually some of the underpinning cultural, social, political, economic factors that have been playing out they've just become visceral within the pandemic, it feels. And now we do need to ask those big questions. Where do we go from here? Because I share those concerns around the public inquiry, and yes, we'll give it our best shot to try and bring a sense of sanity to the conversation, and we'll push and push and push. But at the same time, we have to be asking bigger questions, I think, about where do we go from here, and actually examining how we can course correct our culture that is in many ways under threat. Where do you, I've been, quite frankly, laboring these questions for the last 6 to 12 months, and they're such big conversations. Where do we go from here? What would you say is an important starting point as we kind of look to examine how we can build a brighter future beyond this?
Well, look, we're very like-minded on this, Stan. So I'm delighted to hear of the Elevate initiative, and I love the name. Right, it's a positive name, and one can still fill in what Elevate means, but at least it's a good direction of travel, right? In terms of the starting places, I see this very much as a long-term community development, and as it were, slow trying out of all sorts of things in different countries. So the historical analogy I have in mind a bit is that of the early Enlightenment thinkers, 16th, 17th century. They found themselves in, it was already past the medieval period, but still one where kings and queens and a very small elite were ruling the roost. And it was kind of like the darkness still of superstition was ruling Europe. And they were trying all sorts of stuff, and they started reading, but also they cared about local things, the education of their own kids, the health care of their own community. And so I think that's the space that as it were, the new Enlightenment movement should be in, right? It shouldn't yet immediately fix a goal, but it should indeed talk about, well, one can't say the well-being of humanity is it were the leading principle, but of course the question is how, and what other values should be associated with that and institutions. But to build up locally, and lots of people can start with that, but there also needs to be an alternative media and an alternative form of information sifting, if you like, and you are part of that bit, and I try to play my bit in terms of thinking of new institutions. And I've also started thinking about that for a long time already, as you could have seen in my book. But I think in that sense, I at least am just, one of, I hope, thousands who are thinking out loud as to what our societies can look like. And the answers may differ depending on where in the world you are and what the local problems are. But that, as it were, grows as a network. And so in a way, it's rediscovering ourselves as citizens, as co-owners, and take ourselves seriously as co-owners. So I think that would be my starting point. Stop seeing yourself as a slave who has to follow and who has to comply, but see yourself as a co-owner who's been robbed, and retake that notion that you are indeed a citizen. This country is yours.
Yes, I think to me I describe this as a form of political awakening. Really, it's a sense of agency that one has, and capacity and ability to influence the world beyond oneself, in alignment with other people who are exploring, seeking. And I actually felt a weight lift off my shoulder, actually, when you said that we don't actually need the big goal yet, because actually that's part of the challenge, with the complexity of all of this. I've been seeking, okay, not only where do we start, but what's the trying to delve down into the specific nature of the problems we're solving isn't hard enough, let alone then trying to find through history, what the trajectory has been to get to this point in order to avoid it again in the future. Because history does show that we go in cycles, and there's a fantastic video that's going around at the moment by Ray Dalio looking at market and economic cycles, and how that we follow these patterns year after when we zoom out far enough, we can see these patterns. And I just wondered to myself, are we at the precipice where the pendulum swing? You and I are part of that shift, but do we just? Is this just what happens at the beginning of a new cycle? Is this nature playing out once again? Is there a way that we can actually transcend this cyclical political economic situation? What's your take on that? Can we actually evolve beyond these macro cycles that we witness?
Well, on that, I guess I'm an optimist, but I'm an optimist based on data. So I think life now is a lot better, even post-COVID, than it was for the world as a whole 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, it was a whole lot better than it was 50 years before then, and 50 years before then. So the long arm of history is up, right?
Yes,
people are now much
agreed.
better educated, much healthier, much more informed, much more empowered, if you like, than they have been. Now, the last 2 years have been a huge knock to democracy, reason, the notion of the rule of law, justice, and our well-being. But it doesn't mean that we're truly back in, as it were, 1300. There are only parts of our system which have gone back to 1300s, right? So the politics of our system has gone back to 1300s, but we still have the wealth of, let's say, 1980, right? So we've gone back in wealth too, but we've not gone back to 1300 levels yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a way, it is a new situation, a unique situation. And of course, technology has always gone up, with a few exceptions in history. And so it's a new situation with new tools, and we should consider what those tools make possible that weren't possible before, right? New forms of participatory democracy are now possible that weren't, because it's much easier to combine lots of voices in a very quick way across the world, but also within a country. Artificial intelligence has, of course, changed the nature of the game in the sense that we can try and build, as it were, outside arbiters to some of our systems. And we can also do filtering, right, as groups of media. So I'm, in that sense, much, much more hopeful, right? I do think there is a cyclical component to some aspects of our politics, particularly the inequality, big problems reform cycle, which we seem to be in, right? Effectively, what we're looking at is the outgrowth of a creeping inequality, which has crept up on us since approximately the 80s. We do know from history that inequality is effectively only solved via fanaticism, and we are at the start of a fanatical phase. That is how I see it. And in that sense, we are actors in a play, yes, but the play still has to be acted then. So, but I do see in that sense excitement. It's not that our answers will be the same as the answers they came to in the 50s or the 1880s or wherever it was in different places. There'll be new answers fit for the current age, and they've got to be found. And let's hope we're part of that.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and that's where I hold out hope and optimism. And I agree with you. Certainly the upward trajectory of life, the standard of life for human beings. Yes, there's challenges out there still with inequalities, absolutely, and the mental health crisis and the kind of crisis of meaning are all very, very clear, to us to observe. And it's about how do we now ascend further, how do we evolve further? And you're absolutely right. The pages of tomorrow are yet to be written, and I firmly believe that the pen is in our hands in order to write that future. And I think there are enough of us, and you mentioned earlier that there are a few of us using our voice to speak into that transition that we want to create. But actually there's also plenty of people out there who are yet to use their voice, who have been kind of silently observing. And I always find that the ones that kind of sit and witness are really useful to bring into the conversation, because they kind of take things in at a different dimension. And I'm really excited for those who have yet to form bonds and connection with the kind of people who are examining the future, because I do think we are in that new period of enlightenment. I do think this is a transition. This is beyond within the cycles of life. This is to me, this feels like a tectonic shift. We're at that point where the world has been, the tectonic plates have been moving for a period of time now, but we've seen an eruption, and I feel like now is the time to take the world in a different trajectory. I do want to touch upon, and we've gone way off base in terms of the public inquiry, but I think this is perhaps, given that this is our last episode of the Pandemic Podcast and tomorrow's episode is about the transition, we're actually embodying that as we talk about this. But I think you touched upon AI and some of these, what I would describe as exponential technologies. I too see them as part of the solution, but I also see them as a potential threat in terms of part of the problem. Once again, when it comes to things like technology, whether we're examining COVID-19 or examining technology, I think one of the things that I've observed is happening is we're failing to account for the broader second order consequences or costs and benefits of any given action. how do we take much more of a big picture view when it comes to things like emergent technologies, the things that could support us in terms of moving forward, whilst also, they could, I feel they could leave us on a path of self-termination or a path of self-determination, but it depends on how we use them.
I think the short answer is that nobody has agency over that, and nobody has the organizational potential to basically restrict the path that AI is going to take. So all those organizations, which includes the EU and the UN, who are talking about rules for the use of artificial intelligence, I think they're just smoking out of the back of something. This is a train that'll go on its own trajectory, and so in that sense, the short answer is we'll just see, right? Because it'll happen anyway. Nobody's going to stop that train. But I'm not so fearful of that train. I used to be. I used to sort of, believe in a Blade Runner kind of scenario whereby the super rich would churn out AI soldiers from their factories, and the rest of us would be slave, and soon there would be not many of us for whom there would be a place. I used to think that that was a reasonably realistic scenario, but now I don't, and I don't for two reasons. One is that where human societies are far smarter than any particular human, and so we as human collectives figure out stuff that are beyond any computer, but also beyond any human. And the same is with AI. We will, in a market way, find all kinds of uses for AI. Most of those will turn out to be useless. But then in a kind of meandering, experimental way, we will find how to use it for improving our quality of life, but also our media, our democratic societies, and yes, also for abuse and also for wars. But on the abuse and for wars, I'm also less worried than I used to be, because in that sense, the COVID period has been a helpful reminder of the lessons of the Soviet Union, really. And the lesson of the Soviet Union was that if you try to centrally direct everything, no matter how smart you think you are, you're going to do very dumb things. And we've seen that in spades in this COVID period. The attempt at mass propaganda has led, together with this concentration of power, to a small elite which loves itself, uses all the technology available in order to prop itself up, but really which is lazy and corrupt.
To follow on from this, then, I suppose, we've seen human agencies, human sovereignty challenged, I suppose, over the last couple of years under that kind of centralization of power. How can we ensure that society, humanity, whilst tackling its collective challenges, enables individuals to retain their own sovereignty and agency within that culture?
I think that will be a question for the future, but I think it will be answered by experimentation, and experimentation on the institutions that different countries have. So I was, for instance, in Switzerland last week, and in Switzerland they celebrate a very strong degree of participatory democracy. They debate a lot inside their cantons, of which they have hundreds, and they very much feel like they co-own their society and that their voices are heard. But still they are experimenting with additional forms of democracy there. They are not quite happy with the way, for instance, that their judges are appointed, which is effectively by a political party. I think that one needs fanaticism in order to challenge the centralized power that has arisen. And it's a nasty thing to have to say, but it's very difficult to see how that's going to occur without some major strife, right? Because that is the lesson of Scheidel, who wrote a book about inequality over the ages. But in terms of experimentation, I think this is a matter of generating ideas how to improve our democracies. One of the ideas that I've championed is the idea that we choose the top public servants, including the people who run the BBC, who run the Bureau of Statistics, and that kind of institution, via citizen jury. So one citizen jury, one top position. So imagine 20 Britons coming together for 2 weeks in London, randomly chosen from the database of postcodes. And they come together and they basically sift through the candidates for the next director of the BBC. And they make their own criteria. They use their own judgment and they select someone. And what that does is that breaks the connection between political power and these top civil servants or the top of the group running our society on behalf of us. And hence I expect that to lead to a huge reduction in corruption, but also a huge improvement in everything those civil servants do. So an improvement in the media space, an improvement in the health services. So, the position of Chris Whitty and Valence would also be done by citizen jury, and hence also breaking the stranglehold of politics and of special interest over that layer of society. So that's one of the ideas I have for improving our democracy. But many people are coming out with different ideas. I think it'll be a matter of experimentation.
What fascinates me about this conversation in the context of the COVID inquiry is it feels like the COVID inquiry is one way of drawing a line under what's happened, whilst actually creating the conditions to think about what the future looks like. To wrap up on the conversation around COVID, you co-authored a book called The Great COVID Panic. Could you tell us a little bit about what led to you producing that book and what the readers can expect to find if they were to get a copy of The Great COVID Panic?
Yes, Dan. So I wrote this together with my longtime co-author, Professor Gigi Foster of the University of New South Wales, and an economic consultant, Michael Baker, who's a good writer, basically, a journalist, economic journalist. And so the reason for us to write this book is that we wanted to get a clear picture in our own mind as what had gone on, what the medical aspects were of the whole period. But we also very much were infused by a desire to think out loud about how could we avoid this kind of disaster in the future. And so we were very much animated by the question of, okay, where in history have we gone wrong before with this kind of crowd groupthink? Did we learn our lessons then? And if not, why is it so damn hard? And what could we do in the future? And of course, then, so how bad it is. So the book talks about all those aspects, right? It uses an easy chat style. It tries to make sense of things from the perspective of, as it were, normal people. So we divide up humanity into three groups: the people who sort of are blindly following along, the opportunists who abuse power in this period, and the people like yourself, whom we call Jasmines, who were sort of critical of what was happening, but couldn't really prevent the disaster from happening. It could only commentate to a large degree. And we talk about virology, we talk about the social system, we talk about economics, we talk about corruption, we talk about the sociology of crowds, which is very similar to mass formation psychosis. And we crucially talk about what we think solutions are. And so one of the solutions to the future we had was this notion of citizen juries for top appointments. We also think that would be very useful in allocating grants. And we talked about a World Anti-Hysteria Organization. So that is the interpretation of the COVID spectacle as a result of really an emotional panic on social media, starting in China. And so one of our ideas was to see that as a weather system, and hence think of an organization which could try and stop that in its tracks together with governments. Of course, that would be a new institution which one should distrust immediately. So we also very much have a democratic view in mind as to how one should choose the leaders of such an organization. But that in a nutshell is it. Right? We call for a new enlightenment. We repeat the hopeful things we said before, but we are also very cognizant there in terms of how bad we think the situation is. And so we call the current situation a neo-feudal age, basically ruled by very few of people who also control the airwaves and much of state power.
Fascinating. So it seems like critical reading for our audience in the context of what we've discussed today. Where can our audience grab a copy of that? I've seen the links on Amazon. Yeah. So please grab a copy of The Great COVID Panic. It's a fascinating read, and it's one that everyone needs to be assessed. If you're not going to participate in the COVID inquiry, then at least read this book and understand some of the concepts we've talked about today in more depth. Paul, I appreciate we've had some technical challenges in the closing stages of this interview. Hopefully, we can piece together a cohesive piece of work. But importantly, in terms of our call to action today, we started our conversation around the COVID inquiry. You and I, and joined by a number of others, in looking at how we can actually begin to influence that in terms of reference, and we'll be publishing our guidance within this episode notes to help people to submit that. ahead of the deadline on Thursday night. And we will continue the work to look at how we can move forward from here. And I think that, to me, as we transition between the Pandemic podcast and the Elevate podcast, I think we've bridged those worlds very powerfully today in this conversation, Paul. So I really appreciate your time here on the Pandemic podcast. It's such an important conversation at such an important time. And you've brought great hope that there are great thinkers out there like yourself who are beginning to imagine what the world could look like in the wake of all of this. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and vision for the future on today's podcast.
Thank you for having me on the show, and keep up the good work, Dan.
Thank you, Paul. Goodbye for now. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the Pandemic podcast, well, this is your final chance. Please go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. We'll be letting you know about the transition to the Elevate podcast. We've got an episode coming up tomorrow evening where we'll walk you through the changes we're making. So please make sure you subscribe to our mailing list at danjgregory.com/pandemic. And if you're already ready to take the plunge and join our Elevate community, you can join us inside the Elevate network at weareelevate.org. We're already beginning the conversation about what the world could look like tomorrow. So thank you so much once again, Paul. Thank you to our audience. Please hit the share button, and I look forward to our next episode tomorrow evening. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you very soon on the Elevate podcast.